Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing The We Free Men by Terry Pratchett. This is a Discworld novel, and if you're unfamiliar with Discworld, I've done a whole video on that. I'll link that in the description. But basically, Terry Pratchett is a very funny writer who invented his own fantasy world called Discworld, and most of his books take place there, and they build on each other and relate to each other. And they're listed as a 40-book series, but you don't have to read them in order. There are a very few that kind of, it helps to read them in order, but basically you can pick up any one of those Discworld novels and just start reading. So within Discworld, Terry Pratchett will follow different threads. You know, characters will build on each other, and so he has kind of a series in there about witches, and so this kind of builds on this because this is another witchy book. But then he kind of did something different, and within that series he kind of broke off and started a new series, and this book is actually classified as young adult, which basically just means that the format's a little bit different and the jokes are more intended for a family audience. There are some characters in this book from the other books, but then this one kind of starts a new series. So if you're new to Discworld, this would be a great place to start and just kind of come meet this fabulous world. So this is the story of Tiffany Aching, who is a 9-year-old girl who is just from a normal little agricultural village. She lives on a little farm and makes a lot of cheese until she encounters the Nakmak or We Free Men. So this book was absolutely hilarious. If you have not yet read it, go read it, then come back to hear my opinions. So it was interesting because this book is a young adult book, and most of the Discworld books haven't been. It was formatted a little differently. So most of Terry Pratchett's books don't have chapters or anything like that. They'll have little page breaks that just kind of break the story up and just kind of read it in one big gulp. But this book actually has chapters and a table of contents and all of that stuff. So that was interesting. It was also interesting, it would have little italicized flashbacks in it. So you'd get to kind of go see Tiffany's past, so that was fun. So I really enjoyed this book. I've read all of Terry Pratchett's witch books that came out prior to this. They're my favorite that he writes. And so I thought it was really fun to get to meet a new witch, because we've seen Nanny Ogg and Granny Weatherwax and their whole kind of coven that they've developed throughout time. And we've gotten very familiar with the other witches. So it was really fun to get to see a new witch. And she is very young, figuring out what it means to be a witch. But even though she had nothing to do with the witches from the previous books, you can still see that she definitely is a witch, because she has a lot of the same values that all of Terry Pratchett's witches have. I loved it that they described her as the kind of girl who always had a piece of string, and that she was very methodical. She read the entire dictionary, and then she knew she was strange, and she knew she was different, but she was very unapologetic, and she said, you know what, I'm just that kind of girl. I like to think things out, I'm logical, I'm not super emotional, and I do what needs to be done, and that's okay. I really liked getting to see the chalk. Different places in Discworld feel very distinct, and so it was fun to get to see this new one and hear all about the kind of people who live here and how much they care about their sheep, and it was just really fun to get to see that whole setting. And then I love the idea of the traveling schools, and that you go to school and the cost of education is some produce. So here's an apple, teach me about grammar. Here's a cucumber, teach me about history. That was just so much fun, and I loved how ignorant the teachers were and how all their signs were misspelled, and all of that stuff was so much fun. So of course the highlight of this book is the Nakmak the We Free Men. And so if you've read Terry Pratchett's other witches novels, you get an introduction to the We Free Men in Carpe Jugulum. I loved their amazing Scottish accents, and usually I hate it in a book when they try to write out words phonetically to make them sound colloquial. I have a really hard time reading through them and it trips me up and I can't figure out what they're trying to say, but this was written so well. Just reading this, the words were misspelled in a way that was really easy to understand what they were trying to say, and every time the Nakmak spoke, I heard this great Scottish accent in my head. It was so clever. I loved that so much. And it was great watching them, these chaotic beings, and because Tiffany is a hag, or witch, you know, they rush around and do all her chores for her, and I loved that she said she wished the cat wouldn't eat birds, and so then they set all those little traps for the cat and pretended to dress up as baby birds and teach it that eating birds was not an okay hobby. And that part was just hilarious to me. I loved the image of them picking up a sheep or Tiffany or whatever and then just zooming along and running away and watching that, whatever it was, zoom along, very confused, just being lifted by these wee free men. It was hilarious watching them all interact too. I loved how Daft Wooly was a bit too honest, and Tiffany would ask things and he'd start to answer, and then all the other ones would put their hands over his mouth so he couldn't speak because he was going to get them all in trouble and they couldn't have Tiffany mad at them. Hamish on the buzzard was amazing, and I loved how he like drilled himself into the ground until Tiffany taught him how to use a parachute, and he was using a pair of her pants as a parachute, and I believe in England that means he was using a pair of her underwear, like bloomers or something, so that was just an incredible visual. Oh, and I loved not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than wee Jock, and the whole interaction with Tiffany trying to get his name right, and he insisted that she say the whole name perfectly every time. And then I love getting to go see their whole kind of home and meet their Kelda. And then, you know, Tiffany became the Kelda, and it was hilarious to watch all the men deciding, oh, who's gonna have to marry her. And she, you know, manages to say that she'll marry Rob anybody, but then figure a way to get out of it. And they're all so relieved, and that part was just hilarious. So the whole plot with the parallel universes kind of being a kind of suctioning off of this world and stealing from it was very fun, and we have seen that in Terry Pratchett's Lords and Ladies. I think it was probably a different parallel universe, and so it was fun. If you've read that book before, it was fun to kind of see the similarities, but then this one was also different, so it's a different parallel universe that has latched on, so it has different qualities and stuff. But then you can kind of see there's a sort of rules for how universes have to interact with each other. And I thought it was interesting, the queen was this incredibly vain, powerful, controlling person, but then Tiffany managed to figure out she was just like some sort of a child who had gotten lost and confused, never managed to grow up, and just became this horrid person, but she was really kind of someone to be pitied. And then for most of Terry Pratchett's other witches novels, they tend to kind of parallel stories sometimes. They'll parallel like A Midsummer Night's Dream, or Phantom of the Opera, or Dracula, different things like that. And I wasn't sure if this one was doing that or not, because sometimes it's way more subtle than others, but I did definitely get some Narnia vibes. You know, the land they go to is full of ice, and then she lures away Roland, the Prince Baron's son, with the promise of a certain candy. It just sounded kind of like Narnia to me, and I thought that this could have been like slightly trying to imitate or parody The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I thought the dreams were really interesting, and you know, the first time Tiffany fell into one, she was completely confused and really had to rely on the Knock-Knock-Feagle to help her escape from it. And then by the end, she was willingly diving into the dreams and then creating dreams to use as a weapon. And so I thought that was really fun, and to see, you know, how she used the Jolly Sailor image to kind of create a world where she would have a very good chance to fight back. It was really interesting to watch her kind of reflect on her memories of her grandmother and realize that her grandmother had been a witch, and kind of learn, like, you know, absorb the lessons her grandmother taught her better, and then she was able to work with the dogs, Thunder and Lightning, by the end of it. And it was, and she just kind of came into her own and realized that even though her grandmother was gone, she was still kind of with Tiffany, and then Tiffany could try to channel her grandmother and take her place sort of as the person who watches over the community. Oh, and I would like to point out that this book came out in 2003, that's 7 years before Tangled came out, and when Tiffany had a problem that needed handling, she armed herself with a frying pan, because frying pans are amazing, and I love how common they are now in fiction. And before Tangled came out, before we saw Flynn Rider fighting a horse with a sword in its mouth using a frying pan, Tiffany was arming herself with a frying pan and using it to defeat all kinds of monsters and stuff, and that was her weapon of choice. So I just thought that was amazing, because frying pans as weapons in fiction are like my favorite thing. And so then at the end, after Tiffany had rescued Wentworth and Roland and everybody, you know, I thought it was great that Roland came and apologized to her and said, you know, I'm sorry I took credit, but could you let me keep taking credit? And Tiffany said, oh yeah, well sure, but just remember, when you are the Baron who rules over this land, that I will still be here and I will make sure that you are a good ruler. So, you know, remember that and treat your people the way they should be treated. And that was funny. I really hope, I know this is the first book in like the Tiffany Aching series and it'll go on. I really hope Roland shows up again, because like he's really fun, and I think that could be like a really interesting like love interest, you know. The Baron's son who will be ruling the land, and the witch in training who will be making sure that he doesn't overstep his bounds and treats people with respect. I thought the Toad lawyer was really fun, especially because all the Knock-Knock-Feagle were terrified of words. And, you know, like, poetry was one of their greatest weapons, and when Tiffany was just reading from her sheep manual, like, that terrified them. And so then at the end, the Toad could show up and save the day by showing them how to be proper lawyers. I'm wearing my little Toad earrings in honor of the Toad. So I would look forward to seeing the Knock-Knock-Feagle with their Toad lawyer in other books. Oh, and then the ending was awesome, because we actually got to see Granny Weatherwax and Nanny Ogg again, and it was so much fun to see them from another character's perspective. And it kind of set it up so that maybe in one of these books, Tiffany will go on an adventure with them and they'll help her with her problems, or she'll help them with theirs, and it would be really fun to watch them interact, because, you know, I loved watching Granny Weatherwax try to train Esk in Equal Rights. You know, it was fun to see that dynamic, and it'd be really fun to kind of see her working with Tiffany now. But Nanny Ogg would definitely add something to that dynamic, because she would make sure that Tiffany's education was well-rounded. So I had so much fun with this book. It was a Terry Pratchett Discworld book, so of course I did, but it was just so great. It was fun to kind of change things up and see a different format, and I cannot wait to read more of them.